He thought money gave him everything: land, cattle, men who jumped at his word. But one night, when his pride drove him too far, he saw the terror in her eyes and heard the words that would haunt him forever. "Please, don't lift my skirt." What he did next shattered more than her trust, it shattered him. The richest man in the territory would wake the next day not with power, but with guilt that no fortune could bury, and a secret that would drive his empire toward ruin. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The morning after carried no comfort of routine, no solace in the simple rhythm of a man who had built his fortune on predictability. For when the rancher bent over the silver wash basin and splashed cold water onto his face, hoping the sting might jolt him back into the certainty he once wore like a second skin, he found instead that the reflection staring up was a stranger, a man stripped bare of the pride that had always steadied his jaw, always squared his shoulders, now replaced by eyes he did not recognize, eyes hollow and trembling with a shame that clung to him like the damp mist rising off the water. His hands, which had once signed contracts, swung ropes, and commanded men without hesitation, now shook as though they no longer obeyed him, the tremor betraying what he tried to bury, and he gripped the edges of the basin so hard that the silver groaned beneath his fingers, as if force alone could ground him in the world he had shattered. But no strength could wipe away the sound that haunted him, the small, fractured voice, the plea that cut through the fog of whiskey and power the night before. "Please, don't lift my skirt." Those words coiled in his ears like a snake that refused to strike, their venom slow and burning, a reminder that for the first time in his life, he had crossed a line even he could not forgive. He had always thought himself untouchable, his wealth a shield against consequence, his name enough to silence rumor, his cattle empire too vast for anyone to dare oppose. But standing there in the pale morning light, he felt no shield, no power, only the suffocating weight of what he had become, and it was not the law, nor the town, nor even the woman's broken eyes that condemned him. It was himself, the mirror reflecting the truth he could not outrun. The walls of the room, hung with trophies of his pride rifles polished to gleam, spurs mounted in frames, a map of his land marked with the sweep of his empire seemed to mock him now, relics of a man who had believed possession equaled worth, when in a single moment of cruelty he had lost more than any herd or acre could repay. He rubbed his face raw with the towel, as if he could scrub away the memory. But every time his eyes met the glass of the basin, the shame stared back, unwavering, a scar carved deep into the marrow of his being. The ranch beyond the window still stretched wide. Men still moved like ants across the pastures, cattle still bellowed. But none of it felt his anymore. What use was power when the man wielding it had rotted within? He thought of her, of the way she had turned her face aside, trembling, of the plea that had not been anger but desperation, and the knowledge that he had brought that terror into her eyes twisted his gut until he nearly wretched. He staggered back from the basin, hands shaking harder now, gripping the bedpost as if it were the only thing holding him upright, and for the first time in his life he did not feel like a master but a criminal. Not by the measure of law but by the weight of his own soul. The silence of the room pressed on him, louder than gunfire, heavier than any debt, and he knew then that no coin could bury what he had done. No herd or hired man could drown it. That guilt would follow him like a shadow stitched to his skin, and the empire he had built on pride was already crumbling, for the man who ruled it was no longer whole, and the face in the silver basin would never again be a stranger. It would be his accuser, every morning, for the rest of his days. The mansion that had once thrummed with the clipped heels of servants and the clatter of polished dishes now carried a different music. Low murmurs tucked into corners, glances traded across the wide hallways. A silence stretched taut whenever the rancher passed by, for though no one dared name it outright, the air inside the big house had shifted, weighted by the girl's refusal to meet his eyes. Her silence speaking louder than any cry could, heavier than accusation because it lingered unbroken, unanswerable, a wound festering in plain sight. She moved like a ghost through the rooms, her steps quick, her head bowed, the hem of her dress whispering against the floor as if even the boards beneath her feet wished to swallow her whole. And every time she slipped from his shadow, the servants took note, their conversations folding into hasty whispers the moment he entered, eyes sliding away though curiosity burned hot behind them. The cook muttered over kneaded dough that something ain't right, her hands trembling as she spoke, while the stable boy, usually brash and careless, now lowered his voice to a hiss when he told the maid he had seen her run from the big house at midnight, her face pale as the moon. These whispers, fragile and dangerous, wove themselves into the walls until they could no longer be contained by timber and plaster, seeping beyond the gates with the deliverymen and the hands who carried supplies into town, carried in fragments and hints, never in full, but enough that ears sharpened when the ranch's name was spoken. In the saloon, men hunched low over their glasses, muttering about a girl in that house, and a shadow in her eyes, careful not to breathe the rancher's name too loud, for his wealth stretched like a noose around their throats. But the doubt had taken root, and once rooted, rumor grew like wildfire under brush too dry to contain. In the churchyard, women gathering after service traded looks more than words, but looks were enough. They had all known fear in some shape. All recognized the way a woman avoids a man's gaze when her silence is not shyness but survival. And though none spoke her name, the unspoken truth bound them together, heavy as iron. The rancher, meanwhile, walked the halls of his empire with a tightening chest, sensing the shift though no one dared confront him, feeling the burn of unseen eyes as sharply as if knives pressed into his back, the quiet murmurs pricking him raw, every whisper a reminder that secrets, no matter how carefully buried, find ways to claw through the earth. He thought money could still hold it, still cage the truth within the ranch gates, but already the town's silence was cracking, and though no tongue yet named him, the weight of his guilt multiplied with every hushed word, every servant's glance, every avoided eye, until the once proud ruler of the largest spread in the territory found himself cornered by the one force he could not bribe nor silence. The slow, relentless spread of rumor, rising like water in a flood, unstoppable and waiting for the moment it would burst its banks and drown him whole. The sheriff arrived in the late afternoon, his horse's hooves crunching over the gravel drive with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who wanted his presence felt before his words were ever spoken. And when he dismounted, his boots striking the porch with an easy swagger, the rancher recognized the show for what it was, assurance wrapped in arrogance, the performance of a lawman whose belly had long been filled by another man's coin. They sat together in the study, the sheriff helping himself to whiskey poured from a crystal decanter, his lips curling around hollow comforts, promising that talk in kitchens and saloons would never rise to anything worth notice, that the girl's silence alone was proof no trouble would come, that no jury of ranchers and laborers would dare lift a finger against the richest man in the territory. Yet as the rancher listened, his hands clenched on the armrest, he saw past the drawl and the liquor shine in the sheriff's voice, past the practiced calm of his words, to the flicker in his eyes cold, calculating, not the loyalty of a friend nor the steadiness of a man of law, but the assessing stare of a predator who had caught the scent of blood in the air. For all his reassurances, there was hunger in those eyes, a quiet cruelty that studied the rancher not as benefactor but as quarry. And in that look the rancher felt his weakness laid bare, his guilt bleeding through despite the walls of wealth that had always protected him. He had paid this man for years, lined his pockets, smoothed over violence and theft with cattle and coin, and yet here in the dim light of his study he realized the sheriff was no longer speaking like a servant of his purse but as one weighing opportunity, one who smelled a shift in the wind and was considering whether the balance of power might soon tilt. The rancher tried to steady himself, to meet the sheriff's gaze with the iron pride that had silenced so many before, but the tremor in his hand, the shadow in his eyes, betrayed him, and he knew the lawman had seen it, had tasted the fear he could not hide. The sheriff leaned back in the chair, sipping slow, and with a smirk that cut like a blade, reminded him that in the frontier, wealth bought silence, but silence itself was fragile, easily broken if not fed properly, and the unspoken price of that silence had just grown steeper. When the sheriff left, the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the evening, the rancher felt no relief. Only the echo of those cold eyes following him through the house, whispering what he dared not admit, that even his gold could not cover the stench of weakness now clinging to him, and the very man he had trusted to bury his sins might soon be the one to dig them up, shovel by shovel, until the whole town could see the grave he had dug with his own hands. The nights had become his punishment, long hours when the wind sighed through the shutters like a morning hymn, and the house, once so full of bustling hands and obedient silence, now felt cavernous, each shadow stretching into an accusation. He sat alone at the mahogany table, a bottle of whiskey sweating beneath his palm, glass after glass poured but never numbing the sound that haunted him, her voice, small and breaking, echoing from the dark corners of his mind like a child's prayer warped into a plea. Please, don't. It came unbidden, louder with every swallow, until it seemed the words were not only in his ears but in the walls, seeping from the wood he had built his fortune on, rising from the carpets he had imported from far-off cities, trailing behind him through the halls like a curse stitched to his boots. He would rage at first, slamming his fist onto the table, shouting at ghosts that did not answer, overturning the glass so amber liquor pooled and ran across the polished grain like spilled blood. But even in his anger he could not touch the memory, he could only circle it, drunk and furious, as powerless as the girl's trembling hands had been under his. When rage failed him, he would try silence, sitting in the dark without a lamp, the bottle clasped to his chest, hoping the whiskey would burn away the sound, but it only grew louder, whispering against his ear when he closed his eyes, slipping beneath the door when he locked it, curling around his throat when he tried to sleep. He had thought his empire would be his absolution, that land and cattle and hired men would make him untouchable. But now every acre felt like a graveyard, every head of cattle a monument to a man whose wealth had rotted his soul. Even his reflection betrayed him, for in the windows at night, with the lamplight at his back, he no longer saw the proud rancher, only a hollow man staring out from a shell of his own making, his features sagging under guilt's invisible hand. His riches, once his armor, had become his curse, each coin a reminder of the power he had abused, each contract a nail in the coffin of the man he thought he was, and the house, which he had built to display his might, now felt like a prison, every hallway echoing with the same voice, the same two words, until he thought he might claw at the walls to make it stop. Sometimes he imagined riding out at dawn, leaving it all behind, vanishing into the mountains like a thief. But even in that fantasy he knew the voice would follow, softer perhaps but no less relentless, because it was not only her words but the moment they marked the instant when he had crossed the line between pride and monstrosity, when his empire's foundation cracked and showed him the rot beneath. And so he drank and raged and drank again, but nothing drowned the sound, nothing eased the weight. And as the night stretched into another cold dawn, he sat slumped at the table with the bottle empty beside him, staring at his trembling hands and realizing that for all his power, for all his wealth, he could no longer command even himself. The girl, though carrying scars carved not only on her body but deep in the marrow of her soul, refused to let them harden into chains, for each time she rose from her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, each time she carried a tray into the dining hall with her chin held steady, each time she passed through town with her shawl pulled close around her, she was choosing not to bow, not to vanish into the silence he expected of her, but to endure. And in that endurance was the seed of defiance. It began small, almost invisible, in the way she lingered a heartbeat longer at the well when other women gathered, her soft voice breaking into the hum of their talk, a fragment of truth spilling into ears that had learned long ago to catch more than they ever repeated. And though she did not name him aloud, did not dare give form to the monster in the rancher's house, the weight of her words, the trembling but unmistakable plea for justice was enough to turn glances into whispers. At first, those whispers moved like cautious shadows in kitchens and barns, spoken low as hands scrubbed or hauled, muttered in the pause between hymns at church or during the shuffle of cards at the saloon. But whispers are like sparks on dry grass they catch, they spread, and soon men who had once been deafened by the jingle of his gold, and women who had long suffered in silence began to murmur of her courage, of the quiet fire she carried even after shame had tried to smother her. The town, which had always bowed beneath the rancher's wealth, began to stir, uneasy under the knowledge that someone had dared to speak where silence had always ruled, and though no one yet raised their voice above a whisper, no one dared utter his name, still the current shifted slow, hidden, but relentless, flowing beneath the surface of daily life like a river preparing to flood. The girl, for her part, did not imagine herself a heroine, did not picture revolution, only knew that if she remained mute, her suffering would consume her. And so each word she spoke was a stone laid in the foundation of her own survival. Each confession, a thread weaving a net too wide for the rancher's riches to cut apart. And those who listened, those who repeated her words when they thought no one important was near, found themselves emboldened in ways they had not expected. A ranch hand stiffening when the boss barked too cruelly. A merchant's wife refusing to look away when she saw bruises on another woman's arm. A saloon girl laughing not with mirth but with recognition when she told her companions, "She ain't afraid no more." These small ripples, born of her resolve, carried outward until even the sheriff, comfortable in the rancher's pocket, began to notice the shift in the air when he walked through town, the way conversations hushed too quickly, eyes sliding away too deliberately, as though beneath the surface of every gesture there was a truth waiting to burst forth. And still she went on, scarred but unbroken, her voice no longer trembling as it had that night of her plea, but steady, calm, a quiet flame that cast more light than he could smother, and though the rancher still stalked the halls of his empire, still poured coin into pockets to shield his guilt, he could not contain what had begun the courage of a girl who had chosen not to let his cruelty define her, the spark of whispers that threatened to blaze into a fire that even the wealthiest man in the territory might not survive. It began with small fractures, almost invisible to a man who had once believed himself invincible, the sort of cracks in loyalty that could be mistaken for weariness or bad temper. But beneath the surface they widened with each passing day until even the rancher, drunk on whiskey and arrogance, could not deny that the ground beneath him was shifting. The men who had once jumped at his word, proud to ride under his brand, now hesitated at his orders, their glances sharp with something dangerously close to doubt, their whispers carrying further than he could control, mutterings in the bunkhouse about how a man's gold could no longer buy silence when his sins dripped like blood into the dust. Talk over cards that no cattle herd, no land deed, no bribe to the sheriff could erase the fear etched into the girl's eyes, nor the courage with which she now walked among them. One ranch hand, bold after too many drinks, spat into the dirt and muttered that maybe wealth wasn't worth tying oneself to a man whose name was turning to poison. And though his companions shushed him, the words had been spoken aloud, and words once spoken have a way of sinking into men's hearts. The cook, who had served him for years, no longer forced her smile when she laid his supper down, her silence heavy, disapproving, feeding the unease at the table. Even the foreman, who had profited more than most from the rancher's coin, began to drag his heels when asked to keep the men in line. For he had heard the girl's voice, quiet but steady in town, and he had seen the way others leaned in to listen, the way her whispers had grown into murmurs that stirred not only sympathy but anger. And with anger came courage, the kind of courage that once seemed unthinkable under the weight of his fortune, but now appeared in the squared shoulders of a ranch hand, refusing to work past dusk without pay, in the narrowed eyes of men no longer silenced by the sheriff's badge, in the refusal of a merchant to extend him credit without coin on the counter. The cracks widened into defiance, and though no one yet stood openly against him, he could feel it in the way conversations ended when he entered the saloon, in the way his men lingered over tasks rather than rushing to his call, in the way the town's laughter no longer swelled when he told his old stories, instead dying into awkward quiet that made his chest burn with rage and fear alike. His wealth, once the iron bars that caged the territory, now seemed brittle, each coin slipping from his grip as if it carried the stench of his guilt, and he realized, with growing dread, that money could no longer buy what he most needed: respect, loyalty, silence. The empire he had built, brick by brick, cattle by cattle, was beginning to crumble not because of drought or rustlers or rivals, but because of a girl's refusal to break and the whispers her resolve had kindled, whispers that grew louder each night until they became the murmur of justice itself, threatening to rise into a roar that would sweep him under like a flood. The church bell tolled slow and solemn that Sunday morning, its echo rolling across the settlement like a summons none could ignore, and when the townsfolk gathered, men with their hats in hand, women with shawls pulled tight against the chill, children fidgeting under the weight of silence, none expected the hush that would fall when she rose, slight and pale yet rooted in the aisle as though the earth itself held her steady. Her hands trembled where they clutched the folds of her dress. Her lips quivered as she drew breath. But when her voice came, thin at first, then gaining strength, it carried not just across the pews but into every heart present, for she spoke of what had been done to her, of the night when power had stripped her of safety and pride, when the plea, "Please, don't," had been met not with mercy but with cruelty, and though her words wavered, they did not falter, for every syllable was forged in pain. She refused to keep silent any longer. The rancher sat rigid at the back, his jaw clenched, chest tight as if bound with iron bands. Each word she spoke a blow against the wall of denial he had built around himself, and though he wanted to rise, to shout her down, to call her a liar and remind them all of the gold his hands had fed into their lives, he found that his tongue was ash, his throat closed, his body rooted as every face turned. Every eye, neighbors, hired men, merchants, mothers, fixed not on her in disbelief, but on him in dawning recognition, as if her courage had unlocked the truth they had all secretly suspected. The sheriff shifted uneasily in his pew, his badge gleaming in the dim light like a tarnished coin, and even he did not speak, for the weight of her testimony pressed too heavily, too plainly, to be buried under bribes or threats. Murmurs rippled through the congregation, outrage and pity colliding, some gasping, some muttering curses, others bowing their heads as though in prayer, but listening with ears sharpened. And though the preacher tried to still the storm with a hand raised toward heaven, even his voice cracked under the force of her words, for they had the ring of a scripture long ignored truth, raw and undeniable. The rancher's heart pounded, his skin slick with sweat despite the cool air, because he knew then that the fortress of silence he had relied upon was shattered, that wealth could buy him soldiers and cattle and land, but could not buy back the moment when a trembling girl dared to stand before the town and say what he had done. Shame swelled in his chest like a sickness. Rage clawed at his ribs, but louder than both was fear, the fear of a man who realized his empire rested on the brittle bones of reputation, and those bones had just cracked beneath the weight of her voice. The girl, though shaking, did not weep, did not bow, but met the stares of her neighbors, letting them see not only her suffering but her resolve. And in that gaze the town saw more than accusation. They saw proof that silence could be broken, that power could be named, that the frontier's lawlessness was no longer an excuse for cruelty hidden in shadows. And so when her words finally fell into silence, when the church sat stunned beneath the enormity of what had been laid bare, the rancher felt the eyes of his world upon him, scorching and inescapable, and knew that whether he spoke or stayed silent, whether he fought or fled, his empire would never again stand untarnished, for the truth was out, and the frontier itself had become his judge. The air in the churchyard after her words was so heavy, it seemed the very sky sagged beneath it. The bell long stilled, but its echo still trembling in the bones of every man and woman gathered. And at the center of that silence stood the sheriff, his hand brushing the badge pinned to his chest as though it burned him, torn between the weight of the rancher's coin and the eyes of the people who had watched him grease his palm for years. His mouth opened once, closed again, his throat working as he stared at the girl who had spoken with trembling voice yet unshaken spirit, and then at the rancher, whose bulk once carried the authority of wealth but now sagged under a different weight, his shoulders hunched, his jaw tight, his gaze darting not with command but with cornered desperation. For the first time, the sheriff seemed small in his hesitation, a man teetering between the easy path of corruption and the unbearable pull of conscience. And the town felt it, every villager holding their breath as though waiting for the sound of a verdict. Women stood with arms crossed tight against their ribs, men shifted uneasily, children clutched skirts and sleeves, all eyes fixed on the moment when silence itself would be forced to choose a side. The rancher, feeling their stares like knives pressing into his skin, tried to summon the old strength, the pride that had once cowed these very people into obedience. But when he rose to his feet, the weight of their disgust pinned him harder than any rope, and the voice he meant to boom out like thunder cracked thin, betraying the truth. He could not escape that fear no longer lived in these faces, only loathing. It was a look he had never known, for fear bends heads and closes mouths, but disgust lifts chins, hardens stares, and though the sheriff had yet to speak, though no law had yet been declared, The judgment of the frontier was already upon him. He felt it in the way men he had once hired shifted their stance as if ready to walk away from his brand forever, in the way merchants' wives whispered behind gloved hands, in the way even the preacher did not rise to still the gathering but let the silence grow heavier, more damning. And still the sheriff hesitated, sweat beading at his temple, torn between the glitter of bribes and the raw, undeniable truth ringing in the girl's voice, his badge gleaming like a curse as he weighed which would ruin him faster, betraying the people whose trust was already thin, or betraying the man whose gold had bought his silence for too long. The rancher's chest heaved, his face mottled red with anger and shame. But in his heart he knew the truth that choked him worse than whiskey, that his power had slipped through his hands not because of drought or rustlers or rivals, but because a girl he thought powerless had spoken, and the town had listened, and once heard, they could not return to silence. For wealth could buy land, cattle, even the law, but it could not buy back respect. And what he saw in their eyes now was not fear, but the certainty of his fall, disgust settling like dust across his empire until it would choke him. And as the sheriff shifted, still caught between coin and conscience, the rancher realized that no matter which way the badge turned, the reckoning of silence had already passed its judgment, and he was guilty in every eye that met his. It came not in a single stroke but in the steady, merciless drip of collapse, each day peeling away another layer of the empire he had once believed unshakable, until the rancher found himself standing in the ruins of a life built on coin and pride. First it was the men, the ranch hands who had worn his brand with the swagger of loyalty, now drifting away under the cover of dawn, saddlebags packed, their wages left uncollected because gold from his hand burned hotter than fire, and those who stayed did so not with fealty but with eyes averted, their mutters carried on the wind like a funeral dirge. Then it was the contracts, merchants who had once begged for his business now folding ledgers shut with cool precision, refusing his promises of payment later, demanding coin up front and, when it was offered, sliding it back across the counter as though it carried disease, for the girl's truth had spread further than his cattle could graze, and her quiet courage had become louder than the jingle of his purse. Neighbors who had long envied him no longer nodded at his passing, no longer doffed hats or bent spines, but looked through him as though he were a ghost wandering the dust of his own making, a hollow man clinging to land that no longer bore respect with its grass. Even the sheriff, whose hesitation had been his last hope, began to distance himself, the badge growing heavier on his chest as public disgust grew too thick to wade against. And in that distance the rancher saw the final betrayal, that loyalty bought with coin lasts only as long as coin outweighs shame, and shame had become the heavier measure. At night, when whiskey no longer dulled the edges of memory, he wandered the empty halls of the big house, hearing in the silence the echo of her plea, "Please don't," rattling in every room, haunting the mirrors, dripping from the rafters, until he pressed his hands to his ears like a madman, and yet could not escape it. For her voice lived not in the house but in him, carved into his marrow, rising louder with each day his fortune fell. The cattle, once the pride of his empire, seemed now like ghosts drifting through pasture, their lowing mournful, a chorus to his unraveling. And when he rode the fence lines he saw not prosperity but the futility of a man who had tried to own everything and discovered he could command nothing. His name, once spoken with awe or envy, now carried a sour taste, spat rather than pronounced, muttered in taverns as a warning to others, and even children, who once pointed at his fine horses with wide eyes, now stared at him as though he were a figure of shame, pulling closer to their mothers when he passed. He became, in truth, not a prisoner of law. The sheriff never raised shackles. No cell ever claimed him but bound tighter than iron by the cage of his own guilt, pacing within walls of memory he could not tear down, trapped by the knowledge that what destroyed him was not rustlers or drought or rivals, but himself, a single moment of cruelty that had stripped him of everything wealth had ever purchased. And so, as his fortune bled out through broken contracts, as his men scattered to freer pastures, as his name rotted in the mouths of his neighbors, he sat in his study with the silver wash basin before him, staring once more at a reflection he no longer recognized, a prisoner staring through the bars of his own shame, knowing that he could ride 1,000 miles and bury himself in mountains or deserts, but no distance could silence the echo that followed, No horizon could free him from the one truth he had tried to drown in whiskey and rage, that gold could buy silence, but it could not buy forgiveness, and forgiveness was the only thing he would never hold. The dawn broke pale and thin over the ranch, a light that once would have glinted proudly off corrals packed with cattle, off polished saddles hanging ready for work, off the endless bustle of men who leapt at a single command, but now it spread over stillness, over pastures empty save for a few stragglers left untended, over fences sagging where no hand had come to mend them, over barns whose doors hung ajar in the wind, the once mighty empire of the rancher reduced to a husk, echoing with absence. The men were gone, scattered to rival spreads or vanished with nothing more than muttered curses and saddlebags packed before dawn. Their loyalty bled dry the moment his gold weighed less than the shame tied to his name, and the contracts had dissolved into dust, merchants closing their ledgers with finality. No one daring to lend him trust or credit now that whispers of his cruelty had hardened into truth the whole town carried. The sheriff had turned his eyes elsewhere, feigning impartiality while the weight of conscience pulled him out of reach, leaving the rancher without even the pretense of law at his back, and the townsfolk, once so eager to flatter him, now crossed the street when his shadow stretched too near, their silence sharper than any bullet, a verdict handed down each time their eyes slid past him with disgust. But there, walking down the road into the town with her head high, was the girl no longer the trembling servant whose voice cracked with fear, but a woman who had survived him, whose resolve had grown roots deeper than his cattle ever grazed. And though the scars of that night clung to her, they did not define her, for she carried herself with the steady grace of someone who had broken the silence and found strength in the echo of her own truth, her steps sure, her gaze unflinching, and the people she passed lifted their heads to meet her eyes, some nodding, some whispering prayers, others silent but all acknowledging her as more than victim, as proof that even in a place where gold had long spoken louder than justice, courage could still turn the tide. From the porch of his hollowed house, the rancher watched her go, his hands limp at his sides, his chest hollowed out by a grief that was not for her freedom, though it gnawed at him like a wound, but for the ruin he had brought upon himself, the knowledge that the fields spreading wide before him were no longer his kingdom but his tomb, each empty acre a monument to the pride that had undone him. He had thought wealth eternal, thought his name untouchable, thought his command over men ironclad, but in a single night, with a single plea he had ignored. Please, don't. He had broken not only her trust, but the very foundation of his empire, and now the echoes of that night haunted every corner of his silence, curling in the wind, rattling through the dry grass, whispering in the timbers of the house until he could no longer tell whether he was awake or dreaming. And so he stood, a solitary figure framed against a horizon that once promised endless dominion, now offering only emptiness, watching the girl walk free into a world that had finally chosen to see her, while he remained bound not by law nor prison but by the ruin of his own making, condemned to spend every dawn staring across fields, stripped of meaning, knowing that all he had ever owned was dust, and the only thing left to him was the memory of the night when his pride destroyed everything.